A Little Hatred by Joe Abercrombie, Book 1 of the Age of Madness trilogy, and depending whether or not you want to count short story collections, either Book 7 or Book 8 of the First Law sequence. So I've been a fan of the First Law for, going on 10 years now, I guess, and I've been looking forward to this book all year, and I just really want to talk about it with y'all. I don't have a script here or anything, just a few notes I might glance at now and then, but I don't even think of this as a book review so much, just more of a kind of a conversation. Let's just chill out and let's talk through this, talk through the issues I might have had, the interesting subjects to dwell upon, the themes, the settings, the way the First Law world has evolved over the 30 years since the initial trilogy and the however many years since the standalones. So just kind of, let's really delve into this. Let's get into the meat of it. I'll try to keep the spoilers in terms of the ending and kind of where the characters end up in A Little Hatred specifically. I'll try to keep that light at first, but there will inevitably be First Law trilogy spoilers of some note in this discussion, and so be warned, I guess. I'll try to eventually do more of a review of the First Law trilogy itself, if not the First Law and Best Served Cold, The Heroes in Red Country, and maybe throw a link down there at some point in the future if I do that, but I haven't yet, so I won't go right into the hardcore spoilers for the ending of A Little Hatred immediately. I'll put up a warning first, but yeah, be warned about light spoilers even from the beginning of the review. If for some reason you're watching this without having read it yet and planning to read it, probably not that many people like that, but it's always possible. I will say one thing just to kick off before I get into anything else. I've read reviews online of people saying, like, you could start here if you want. You don't even have to read the First Law trilogy first. Nope, that's not correct. You do have to read the First Law trilogy. You at the very, very least have to read The Heroes. I would just... the books are all good. Just read them all. Sharp End is the short story collection. Okay, you could skip that. You'd be fine. But yes, you should read this 7th, at least, of the books, if not 8th, after Sharp Ends. And it would be like starting Game of Thrones with Season 5 to start with this book. You do need to read everything else. But anyway, now that I got that little disclaimer out of the way, just something that bugged me. I saw some people say online, let's get into A Little Hatred. Let's talk through this. Kicking things off, first, synopsis and initial thoughts. So, echoing the simultaneous twin wars against Gurkle and the North we saw in the First Law trilogy, here the Union and some of the initial leads from the first trilogy now moved into a supporting character position, and many new characters, mostly the children of the kind of lead characters from the first trilogy, again waged twin wars, now against the anti-industrialist Breaker uprising in the city of Valbec, and again against the North, specifically against the marauding armies of Stour Nightfall, as the book jacket describes them. And first thoughts on the book, I liked it, which is good. It would suck if I had looking forward to a book all year and then didn't like it, but only it's happened with movies before, hasn't it? But anyway, Joe Abercrombie, he writes with great urgency and energy and wit in both his prose and his dialogue that really stands out from most other fantasy I've read. You can feel the sweat coming off these characters. You can feel just the sheer energy of it all. It drives forward in a way that I find in this book and Abercrombie's other books. It forgoes the cruft, I guess you would say, of traditional fantasy. Abercrombie, he's very to the point as a writer. I wouldn't go so far as to say the First Law trilogy could have been, a 7 or a 10 book epic with the amount of plot in it, but it could have easily been, 3 much longer books, books that didn't get to the point so much, 1,000, 1,200 page tomes. But Abercrombie's really good at just cutting to the heart of things, and that continues to stand in A Little Hatred. We're hitting events that are fairly huge and spectacular and climactic by page 200 some odd in this book, which I love. There's always the kind of cliche with fantasy that it takes forever to get to the point, And this book, that does not apply. We were just into things in this book just about right away. And yeah, shit's hitting the fan, and it's on in this book pretty quickly. And I respect and admire that about Abercrombie. If I ever try to take a more proper shot at writing, I will definitely try to, I don't want to say rip him off in that respect, but yeah, try to rip him off. And if anything, I would say this book's arguably even more to the point than The Blade itself, the first book of the First Law is, which I guess you can see somewhere about where I'm pointing here. Now, as we get into this book, we're very much in sort of an industrial revolution. As the book puts it, I believe it says, the age of the machine has dawned. We have factories, we have presses, we have industry, we have mills, we have certain levels of firepower and steam power, and the description. We aren't quite so far as to have cars or anything yet, or there aren't any guns. There are cannons, but very much we're industry is blooming rapidly, and it's a different world than the one we left even as recently as Red Country. Certainly a different world than we left way back in Last Argument of Kings, set 30 years earlier. And this fusion of kind of high fantasy elements and a world where magic does still exist. It's faded, but it's present. I'll discuss the role of magic in the book in a little bit, but combining sort of a high fantasy, gritty high fantasy with the Industrial Revolution, it's unique. These aren't novel comparisons, but I'll say what it actually kind of made me think of. If you've seen this TV show, is The Legend of Korra, the animated sequel to the TV show Avatar: The Last Airbender. Now that one took things even further. There actually was cars even and stuff, but it blended magic and technology. And this made me think of that, actually. It also made me think of some of the later Final Fantasy games in that respect. Specifically, I'd say one of my favorite games of all time, Final Fantasy VI. Again, that one brought in trains, which this one doesn't go quite so far as, but there are industrial elements. There's very mechanized factories and stuff in this book, which actually a huge portion of the plot revolves around, and how that impacts the peoples of Adua and Midderland and the Union and whatnot. But we combine. There's still sword play. There's still a little hint of wizardry, less than there's been in previous books in the sequence, but it's there, and that's alongside early engines and industry, and the descriptions of the streets of Adua as characters write down them under construction sites and smoke and scaffolding and machinery. It all has a little bit of a steampunk flavor to it. Not too over the top. It doesn't feel like it's ripping off the kind of steampunk genre necessarily, but that element's definitely there, and it's cool. It gives it very much a flavor that stands out unique from the rest of the series up to this point, while still definitely taking place in the same world, politically and tonally, which we'll get into. Now, as I mentioned, this is magic exists, but this is an incredibly low magic fantasy novel. Not quite zero magic, but basically all magic in the entire novel takes place entirely in people's minds, whereas the previous books did have a more literal and explosive magic at points, with Baez literally blowing people to pieces at several points in the First Law trilogy. We don't have that so much here. We have more magic takes place through something called the Long Eye, which is kind of a psychic power type thing. I'll go into it a little more when we discuss the characters, but so it's very limited magic. Almost feels like more like slightly supernatural flavored historical fiction at points, echoing some kind of real world uprisings, and it's interesting how he does it. Personally, I wouldn't. Would I want every fantasy novel to be this low magic? No, I would get a little. I'd get a little bored. I'd get a little anxious to have some more mystical worlds to explore, a little more spells and wizardry. But in the case of this book and the tone it was going for, I would say it really, really worked, and it was interesting and gave it a nice flavor. Now, I'm certainly not without criticism. First thing that comes to mind, really, as far as things I'm not sure I liked as much, is I feel like the new cast was arguably introduced too quickly. The first Law trilogy really it focused on three kind of major characters through a good portion of the first part of the Blade itself, mostly on the trio of Logan Ninefingers, Sandan Glokta, and Jazal. And it really let you get a good feel on these characters and explore and learn about the world through them before we kind of worked in a few more characters as the novel and series went on. And I thought this really worked really well. A Little Hatred really just, it has 7 viewpoint characters and a few other chapters that show even more, and it just really throws you into them right away, kind of evenly mixed up all the same. And I don't know, maybe it was a little too much. Maybe I would have liked something more like the first Law trilogy, where it chose about 3 or 4 and kind of dealt you into the world a little more slowly. But and that's how he chose to do it, and I can respect that. But in the early stretches, I found it to be arguably a little overwhelming at points. Kind of like, I want to get back to so and so, but I have all these other characters to get through first. And it was a little, it was different. I wouldn't say it was like disastrous by any means whatsoever, but probably if I had to pick a way I'd prefer it, I'd pick kind of the first Law's more gradually expanding focus. But another thing, and I'm not sure if I necessarily am even saying this as a negative criticism, more positive, more just kind of an observation, is romance is definitely more prominent in this book than ever before in the First Law world, more so than the trilogy, certainly more so than Best Served Cold, The Heroes, Red Country. We have full-blown love triangles. We're getting our Twilight on in the back half of this book in particular. It's not a huge deal, and I'm not even saying I didn't like the characters involved, but if it continues to be this heavy, and I believe the next 2 books are The Trouble with Peace and The Beautiful Machine, I'll admit I could see myself getting a little tired of it. What can I say? I'm a dude. I'm in this for the world building and the violence and the politicking and the magic, less so the romance. What can I say? It's who I am. But speaking of the subsequent books, I will say this feels less like a book 1 than the Blade itself did. And at the end of the Blade itself, if you've read it, and I'm hoping you have, if you're watching this review, the characters kind of set out on various adventures at the end, to the west and to the north, and it very much had like, okay, that's the end of book 1. We're on to new missions and new adventures for book 2. It's all set up. Whereas minus like the last 10 pages or so, A Little Hatred could almost feel like another standalone. Like it doesn't have the book 1 flavor so much. It doesn't leave that many plot threads open. I mean, it does leave some. I shouldn't go too far, but certainly not compared to the Blade itself. Like at the end of this book, if Joe was to announce, the next book was set immediately, like before their hanged was, if he announced, this is set 5 years later, book 2, I'd say like, okay, I can see that. So it's different, it's not just ripping off the structure of the Blade itself necessarily, but some things work, some things I question. But, I guess I've discussed the world and the plot enough. How about we go into the characters? Part 2, a more likable cast. This is actually an angle that I haven't, to my surprise, seen that many reviewers of this book really go into, and it's something that popped out at me like immediately and inescapably. Compared to all previous Abercrombie First Law books, perhaps Best Served Cold at the most extreme end of an evil cast, and maybe a Red Country at the other end. But certainly compared to the First Law trilogy itself, we have a far more conventionally likable cast of characters here. And in that sense, I guess I'll actually disagree with critics who say this book is super grimdark. It's the grimdarkest of the grimdark fantasy. I actually, I don't agree. I mean, things are certainly still morally ambiguous, with especially on the breakers end of the war, of the uprising kind of anti-industrialist movement in Valbec, and they are antagonists, but they have plenty of legitimate points, legitimate economic arguments, and even likable characters amongst them. Heck, I'd say one of the leaders of the Breakers is probably more moral than many of the people on our side. But at the same time, looking at our side compared to, the first Law trilogy, where you had a murderous barbarian, and a torturer, and a spoiled brat, and all the rest of them. I mean, we have what I would look at as more conventionally likable heroes here. I mean, Leo Dan Brock, who's sort of the military protagonist type of this book, I would say he is by far the closest thing this entire world has ever seen to a conventional fantasy hero. Yeah, I mean he's a bit stubborn, he's a bit bullheaded, but ultimately when it comes down to it, you look at Leo Dan Brock, you have a handsome, brave, selfless, patriotic, gifted swordsman who fights always in the vanguard of the battles, and we see in his head he mourns truly for his lost friends, his failures. He truly wants to fight for his countries, his people, his homeland. The twists against that are really, I wouldn't say they're non-existent, but they're very light. There's all these funny references to that he might be secretly gay, which is kind of like, all right, fair enough. But yeah, if anything, the twist of him is the lack of twist compared to every other book of this series, really. I mean, Leo Dan Brock could be the protagonist of a heroic fantasy novel from the 80s, and he would fit in. I mean, it wouldn't not work. So in that sense, I mean, we have kind of here a true kind of classic fantasy hero, and I'm surprised at how few reviews of this book I've seen mention that, because I mean, it really popped out at me. Anytime we're in his head, I mean, he just wants to fight the bad guys. He wants to protect his country, and he's everyone else. And we see in other people's heads enough to demonstrate that. Yep, he is handsome as hell. He's likable as hell. He's a great warrior, and so it's kind of interesting. It's much more conventional. It's not that we've never had likable characters before. I mean, in Red Country, I would consider Shy South to be likable, but even she was far more of a scoundrel and a thief than Leo is. Crown Prince Orso and the Dogman's daughter, Ricky, I believe it's pronounced. I'm not 100% sure, but I'll go with Ricky. At first I was saying Reich, but I don't think that was right. I think it was Ricky. I would say they're on the likable end of things as well. Orso, shockingly so. He's quite humble and good intentioned. The book's kind of jacket and pre-descriptions are all described him as a feckless coward, and it's almost funny reading it because that's more how he thinks of himself. He's not a smug bastard like his father Jazal was in the first books. He does, like Leo, he, in his own kind of sometimes fumbling, imperfect way, I mean, he does want to bring the world to a slightly better place than he came into it. He doesn't always succeed. I mean, I'm not saying because it's not the grim darkest book ever that it's all lightness and rainbows by any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, I mean, Orso, he's not like a prick. He's not a bastard. He's a little spoiled, a little naive, but he has relatively good intentions. He doesn't want to rampage into Valbec and see all the breakers put to the sword. Not at all. He wants a peaceful solution. And that's interesting. Again, that kind of separates him from many, many other characters we've seen throughout this saga. Going back to Best Served Cold, where basically the entire cast is some degree or another of legitimately evil. And Ricky's basically continuing the tradition of the Dogmen and other more or less likable kind of northern rapscallions from the first trilogy, and the heroes as well. She's not like a living saint. She has her issues, but we see enough into her head to be she's on adventure. She means more or less well. She doesn't like the bastards on the other side. She doesn't do anything outstandingly cruel to anyone at any point in the novel by this series standards. Yeah, you're reading it and you like her and you're into her journey. It almost kind of despite her being the Dogman's daughter, I see her in certain ways her arc reminds me a bit of Logan, Nine Fingers from the first trilogy, because we kind of come in and she's initially on the run from, the northern lords, like the not England, but the true North, the northern rebels against the Union, and she's kind of on the run from them, and it's Logan Nine Fingers ish, at least Logan from like the first half or so of the Blade itself, and even Savine Dan Glokta. She's probably the least likable of the four I've just mentioned. Easy into her head a bit. She's a little snooty, a little superior, a little bitchy, but even in light of all that, she's quite easily a step up morally from her torturing father, Glokta, from the original trilogy, like by far. So she's almost our least likable, maybe, of the main set, yet still has like a moral leg up on most characters we've seen throughout this whole sequence of books. So it's kind of interesting to look at them all together and see, like, yeah, this isn't particularly a vile or cruel or selfish bunch by what's supposed to be, the very grim, dark standards of this series. And I'm surprised how few kind of reviewers and whatnot of this book I've seen really discuss this, because it really leapt out at me. Within 50 pages, I was thinking all about this, especially in the Leo chapters. I was like, this is just a straight up fantasy hero. And I couldn't believe it from this series. I kept waiting for maybe the twist that didn't quite come, and I don't even mean that as a bad thing. I think is kind of an interesting, different direction to take in certain ways. And there are other characters to discuss, notably Gunnar Broad, Jonas Clover, the Northman, Stour Nightfall himself, and some other returning First Law characters. Good number, actually, in fairly minor roles here and there, but that I have to get a little more into spoilers on, so we'll discuss them later. Part 3, Theme: The More Things Change. I see a central theme of A Little Hatred being that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Let me explain what I mean. The dawn of the machine and the Industrial Revolution ideas of this novel are very fresh and different, both for this series and for fantasy books in general, if we're being honest. Especially so in its very kind of realistic minded depiction of how factories and industry and assembly lines and even simple machinery are taking people's jobs and impoverishing parts of the populace. And it's a book with economics on its mind, which, is that really, we think of a fantasy more as, battling dark armies and evil wizards and whatnot. We don't think of it that way. And again, I'm going to make another comparison to The Legend of Korra here. Bear with me if you've never seen it and have no idea what the hell I'm talking about, but the peasant uprising as our villains reminds me of the first season of that show. The Equalists were the villains who we don't like them. We don't like their methods, certainly, and much of it, but we see their point of view. We can understand the kind of moral place they're coming from, yet they still are our antagonists. But even as we look into this fresh, new conflict in this series, we continue the war from almost exactly from the First Law trilogy, the War with the North, and continue it from the heroes, even involving many of the very same figures, like a Calder, Scale, the Dogman, Call Shivers, Finri Denbrock from the heroes. And reading this, it's like we never left. It's like we never left those books. We're still fighting the same descendants of Bathod, the same territorial battles amidst the kind of the lower reaches of the North and Upper England, and we got duels and messy supply lines and bloody showdowns and the whole deal. If this section was the whole book, if we only had this war in the North and didn't have the Valbec peasant uprising at all, I think this book would be quite rightly criticized as just kind of a lazy remake of the heroes, basically. But as is, we do have all that Valbec stuff, and I feel like this bifurcation, this very sharp bifurcation between the totally new and the pointedly and clearly rehashed, it can't be accidental. It seems to suggest rightly how much certain things stay the same. I mean, we have technical revolution, we have new technologies, we have to adjust and grow with the times. But at the same time, many things do indeed stay the same. This is reflected in the real world. Endless cycles of war and military occupations, seemingly in the same place generation after generation. And that's true in this world. We have our new conflicts in Valbec, our old conflicts in the north, which have been going on from page one of the Blade itself, published a decade and change ago. And here in the real world, certainly we're still in, similar conflicts in similar countries 30 years later. We sure as hell are. So I feel like that's kind of what the book is saying, is some things change, some things absolutely do not. And I think that brings this discussion to a point where it's hard for me to go on much longer without getting into spoilers. So without further ado, I'm going to launch into full spoilers for A Little Hatred, up to and including the final page. So if you don't want any of that, go ahead and check on out. Come back and enjoy the rest of this review later, I hope. But if not, I'll talk to you in another video. All right, spoilers now. Let's go area by area. We'll start in what I just talking about, the North. As I just mentioned, the war against Stour Nightfall in this book is very much continuing the tradition of the wars against Bethod and Black Dow and Scale. And we find out, of course, that Stour Nightfall is the son of Calder, Black Calder as he's called these days, a character who was positioned, more as a villain in the initial trilogy, but we came to like and respect and a bit more in the heroes. And we find out, yep, this is Bethod's bloodline continuing the same damn war. And so who's Stour up against? He's up against Ricky, of course. I believe Ricky was the first chapter, if I recall correctly. And again, on the run from the beginning, just like the Blade itself. I would say, is her storyline as compelling as Logan in the first book? Nah, I wouldn't say so. But Logan is, to me at least, kind of an all-time classic fantasy literary character. Ricky, could she get there? Maybe. Not quite there yet, but, I did like the kind of buddy cop aspect with Isern Efael. It was like, I liked that. I liked the totally disgusting depiction of her long eye through the novel with... she would shake and literally shit herself when the visions overtook her. And that was amusing. It was kind of... it's Joe Abercrombie. He mixes up his mythology and his high fantasy with some of the grungiest humor, and I enjoy that. And I liked the description of the long eye itself. It was, like I said, the most magical part of a relatively non-magical novel. But I liked, for example, she'd see a sword. She would see the ore being, mined for the sword, the process of the sword in the smithy being made, everyone who'd ever touched it, the lives of people who touched it, the names of their children and spouses, and every person the sword had ever killed, and it would all hit her at once in 1 second. And we went into that with multiple objects with her, and it was well done. I thought it was pretty cool. I liked the long eye sections of this book. And then also in the North, of course, perhaps the northern protagonist. Well, that's not fair. I'd say Ricky and Leo kind of share that duty, but we have Leo, and he's kind of, as I said, our relatively conventional hero. Give or take the not subtle gay thing. That's kind of almost too hinty around that. It's like, all right, shit or get off the pot on that one, Abercrombie. But I found myself looking forward to his chapters, if only because they consistently contained a lot of good old fighting and battling. And there's always room for that in this kind of heroic fantasy. The First Law trilogy, it's darker and more thoughtful than some other fantasy, but I never have found it pretentious either. It always finds room for cool action scenes, and a lot of that is found in the Leo chapters here. And as has always been the case with these Joe Abercrombie First Law books going back to the beginning, I really, really enjoyed the duel chapter, the duel between Leo Dambrock and Stour Nightfall. Maybe I'd call it the most purely enjoyable chapter from the book, if not necessarily the most thematically urgent or well written or anything, but it's just fun. I just like to read Joe Abercrombie's duels, and going back to the fencing tournament and the blade itself. I've always enjoyed that kind of thing here and continue to enjoy this one. Totally dug it. Really dug the duel chapter. Speaking to returning characters, as I mentioned earlier, it was great to see the Dogman again, and Carl Shivers as well. Carl Shivers almost being the one who's had the most of a story arc, really, throughout, 7 books now with him, and that's kind of cool. The Dogman was probably the most conventionally likable of the main cast back in the day, and I'd say he remains so of the returning characters. Shivers, his ever-shifting character alignment, to use a D&D terminology, it seems to have wiggled back into the good end a little bit. I mean, Ricky's certainly always glad to see him. And it was good to see a Wonderful and Finrey Dan Brock as well. Kind of continuing on the heroes. If I would say don't read this book unless you've read all previous First Law books, but certainly not unless you've read the heroes, because in a lot of ways the North section of this book is a sequel to that more than anything else, And then we have Jonas Clover. He's probably one of the less compelling new characters. Until the end, actually, I'd say he almost felt more like a Cryndon Craw from the Heroes version 2.0, just more of our incidental viewpoint into the northern side of the war, more than a true kind of three-dimensional character. But that said, the final northern chapter with the kind of mini red wedding almost of a Stour killing a Scale and Clover betraying and killing Wonderful. It was a really well done little gut punch to kind of recontextualize this character Clover. A good moment overall. It's almost interesting because he's an anti-villain through most of the book. He's on the villain side, but we like him nevertheless. Until the end, when it turns out maybe he is in fact just a fucking villain with his stabbing of Wonderful the moment he's told to do so. You could argue there was no way out of it for him, but would Craw from the Heroes have done the same? No, certainly not. Nor would most of Logan's band in the initial trilogy. So yeah, Clover, in the end, not a good person actually, which is interesting. It's almost as Leo kind of slots more into the traditionally heroic role. We see our northern character who, in like a simpler fantasy novel, would be villainous. Maybe he is in fact villainous. But speaking of Stour, one last thing, I would hope to see the Stour Leo alliance or friendship continue into future books. If they just go straight back to Stour being all villain towards Leo and the Union again, I'd be a little underwhelmed by that. I would feel like that was a little bit disappointing given where this book ended up. So I do hope to see more Stour Nightfall, Leo Dan Brock scenes going forward in future books. So I liked all these northern chapters, but I couldn't really call them the true heart or brains, as it were, of this book. More it's guts, it's muscle, it's sweat. For its kind of brains, you'd have to look to Valbec, I think. So let's go into the Valbec chapters. I mean, Savine Dan Glocta was so wealthy and snooty and successful in all things straight from the beginning of her introduction to the book that there's no denying it was great seeing her get caught up in the shit, basically, here. Just as it was enjoyable seeing her get her fencing skills brutally checked by Bremer Dan Gorst earlier in the novel. And by the way, I'm really glad that chapter went that way. I was getting a little nervous. We were going to get some cringy, like, girl power shit with that scene. So when Glocta gave Bremer permission to go full bore against Savine for a second, and we saw the result, I was like, okay, Abercrombie's keeping it realistic. But okay, so we have that peasant uprising in Valbec, the uprising of the breakers, or is it the burners in this case? And done from many points of view, as we've seen in previous First Law novels, and this was incredibly well done. In terms of skill of writing, I think it's probably hard to argue this isn't the pinnacle of this book. You could feel the smoke and the terror and the fires and the bloodshed just roiling up out of the page. Like I've said before, it felt more like historical fiction than fantasy. I mean, I can imagine basically this having happened in the real world many times. So, of the three new major kind of non children of the First Law characters, Gunnar Broad, Vic Dan Teufel, and Jonas Clover, I would definitely rank Broad at the top. You felt the conflict in him from kind of his first chapter and the struggle in his heart between civilization and his family and murder and bloodshed. And you felt his desires to be a violent man conflict with his love for his family. And but his daughter May, also a tough cookie and an interesting character. I really liked her, very cool. I liked her relationship with Savine Danglocta as well, and kind of where she ended up in the novel. And I loved Broad's evolution from from poor man and struggling worker up to being Savine's enforcer by the end of the book. Great arc, really well done. You mourn a bit his kind of shifting back somewhat into a life of violence, but certainly you're happy to see his success. I liked Broad a lot, and definitely happy to get back into him in the next novel. And now time to criticize a little bit. Vic Dan Teufel made little to no impact on me whatsoever. I found all of her chapters to be relatively forgettable, and she's one of Abercrombie's few kind of whiffs of a character to me. If she just straight up wasn't a viewpoint character anymore in The Trouble with Peace, then I would shed no tears over it. While we're nitpicking, here's another little thing I was not quite sure about. Maybe I was misreading Salem Ruse's age at the beginning of the First Law, but it seemed like he was already, an adult and noble and established member of kind of the Auduan inner circle at that point, which is set, quite a number of years back from here. And but now it seemed like his current iteration as Pike, the military man, it seemed like he was kind of being written as a still like tough, gruff military dude, like maybe in his 50s or 60 at the oldest. But shouldn't the dude be like well in his 70s by this point? Don't get me wrong. I was happy to see him. I've enjoyed his arc, certainly through the First Law trilogy, into being a hardened prick from, the chubby boy he was at the beginning of the Blade itself. But he's arguably the one character who didn't seem like convincingly and accurately aged to me. Like he was definitely seemed like he was written as somewhat younger than he should have been here. Now, as I've said, given the very sharply critical pre-release descriptions of Prince Orso, I found him to be shockingly likable. I'd probably go so far as to call his chapters my favorite, actually, or at least they would be if they weren't quite so romance and love triangle centric. But I consistently enjoyed the just pure, just dripping self-deprecation of Orso. It had the funniest stuff in the book. I was laughing out loud a few times at basically how much this dude hated himself. He's so like self-critical, and it was basically like a running internal monologue on him being a loser and his spoiled nature for the whole book and his failures. And I would say it's definitely the best kind of internal monologue we've seen in this series since Gorst in The Heroes. I guess I would say that the Orso Savine kind of incest stuff kind of at this point it's becoming sort of modern fantasy cliche to me, I think, and to the genre. There's got to be some incest. This is fantasy. This is dark fantasy. We got to have some incest. But my favorite Orso relationships in the books were actually probably with his parents. His two very distinct relationships with Giselle. I love seeing them fence together, and with Therese, another returning character who I should mention. She very much felt like she had evolved straight off the page from how she was in Last Argument of Kings, and I did like Orso and her relationship too. It's kind of some just tense kind of family tension there. Funny stuff. And getting back to Volbeck specifically, and not just the main characters there, I would say the cynical heart of this novel lays in the fact that the more well-intentioned and likable and less violent-minded leaders of the Breakers were the ones hanged after the uprising. Well, the real villains of the Breakers, the Burners, I should say, Judge and Risa escape with their lives to burn and break again one day. And this is a real kind of first law thing to have happen, I would say. And I would certainly say it finds its reflection in real life events, such as, drone attacks supposedly retaliating against terrorists and instead obliterating civilians. Again, a thing that very much happens in the real world. And I would say that was reflected here. The true violent ones aren't the ones who pay in this novel. And that's tragic, and it's kind of heartbreaking, and it feels realistic and convincing to me. And it's also one of those things where it's kind of like, where do we go from here? That's kind of why I was talking about how I don't see this as much as a book one as The Blade itself, because that storyline feels relatively kind of self-contained to me. It's like, yep, this is how things end up. But I don't know, maybe in future books we'll see Judge and Reesenow again. Judge certainly feels like a character that has a story left to tell, as a fairly psychotic villain. She's the Joker of this series, I think. And finally, let's get back into Adua itself. I loved seeing Adua again, but once characters start to come together there, I would say that's where the book becomes a little too romance focused for my taste. Hell, it becomes not, I'm mentioning a love triangle. That's not actually accurate, is it? It becomes a love square with Leo and Ricky and Orso and Savine, and I'd be lying if I said I was super into all this. But that said, it is all made up for with the return of Baez. And he seems somewhat more friendly than we've seen him lately. Certainly more friendly than he was with Jazal at the end of Last Argument of Kings, but still with a certain amount of menace, of course. And I'd say he's more open than he's almost ever been before. Minus, maybe keeping the truth about Jazal's false status as a king's bastard, and he keeps that to himself. But other than that, he's pretty open about almost everything, about what happened in the First Law and where he's coming from and what his intentions are with Ricky and the other characters he talks to. He just straight up lays it all out there about being the first of the Magi and all the events going up all the way through what happened with the Seed and Last Argument of Kings. And Baez is always a thrill to see on screen in these books. You always feel like on screen, if it was a TV show, there would be like a special guest appearance by Baez credit, and they hold it. I didn't think we were going to see him. I honestly didn't. So by the time he suddenly popped up out of nowhere, towards the end of the book, I was like, oh, yes. Baez, super cool. I like how Joe held him back. It was well done. But I guess we got to talk about the big event of the last, 2-3 pages of the book. Spoiler alert, the death of King Jazal. So I'll admit to being a bit underwhelmed, maybe. Not that I think Jazal was above death. Don't read grimdark fantasy if you don't want to see your characters die in these post Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones days. But the quiet, mysterious death with him in bed, I don't know. I actually had a theory 2 chapters earlier during the big military parade for Leo that we were going to see a JFK reference, basically, with Jazal being assassinated during the parade, perhaps even the simultaneous revelation that the gun had been invented in this world. And I was a little bit disappointed at the end of that chapter when, give or take a little bit of long-eyeing from Ricky, the parade seemed to basically go well. So I was like, oh, okay, Jazal lives again. Then a couple chapters later, oh, no, he doesn't. I was like, oh, little turnaround and kind of a less than pleasantly structured way for me as a reader. But, I did like seeing Glokta again and Bremer Dan Gorst in Adua. Abercrombie knows how to hold back Glokta, just as he did with Baez. He's like Spielberg holding back that shark in Jaws. Not too much Glokta, just enough, I'd say. Given that, though, that Jazal was going to die at the end of the novel, I probably would have liked to have a few more chapters of his appearances. Because, I liked Jazal. You could see a certain unhappiness in him that was well done, but he had also kind of somewhat evolved into his role as a somewhat impotent statesman. And, I did like that. But, yeah, I'm glad we'll probably see more Glokta again going forward. And I like the way they used him in this book, even if the Vic chapters he often appeared in were kind of a little to me. So, as I said, if I have a greater critique outside of maybe the love triangles, it's that I'm not sure about this as a book one of a trilogy. The Blade itself saw set up conflict and saw our characters in various directions, west to the north, Jazal and Logan to the west, Glocta to the south, and various military or magical journeys. And this one, so what's left really? Is Stour and Nightfall going to attack the Union again? I would hope not, but I guess we'll see. And hunting down Judge, maybe? Okay. I mean, she's not Sauron, she's not Voldemort, she doesn't pose that kind of a threat. So, but overall, I did enjoy this novel very much. I continue to enjoy Abercrombie's prose, his wit, his dialogue, his action scenes, his kind of grittily realistic world building, and I found myself reading 50 plus pages in one sitting a couple times here, including the set of chapters with the peasant uprising with Savine. I was a bit concerned about a kind of woke element would be present in it after reading one online review that commented about xenophobic hatred against refugees being a major theme of the novel, which I was reading that before the book came out, and I was like, oh, no. But this is actually only found in like about 2 sentences in the whole book, so I think that was just that reviewer maybe glomming on a little bit too much to something they were interested in. It's actually not a major theme of the novel at all. I mean, I guess if you want to talk about real world political analogies, certainly the the economic factor, the rise of industry, the people finding themselves unemployed is a theme, but I don't think it comes down hard on one side or the other in a cringy way. Like I said, I mean, the peasant uprising, the Occupy Wall Street of this book are technically our antagonists. Ones we can kind of see their point of view, but it's not like a simplistic depiction of one side good, one side evil. It's not the dark side and the light side of the force. There's, it kind of, it asks you to examine each character and each side and choose where you think, moral rightness is, and see if our characters can kind of find their way up around that puzzle. This being the first law, it seems likely they might not in the end. But no, I wouldn't say the book has any kind of real world political parallels that come across as cringy or awkward or woke to me. And as I said, I wouldn't want every fantasy novel to be this low magic, but I did enjoy the steampunky vibe and the grit and the low magic aspect of this one, and I hope to see it develop more as this trilogy goes on. Maybe we get a fucking Zeppelin in book 3. Why not? I already made a Final Fantasy comparison. Let's get our goddamn airships on here, right? And the characters, as I said, a little lighter and more likable than before, but they still have enough conflicts, both internal and external, and the themes of the book are still kind of dark and thoughtful, and it's still mixed with humor and great action and battles, and altogether just was a very kind of readable, enjoyable, and somewhat intelligent experience. So overall, I liked it a lot. I'm not sure where this is going. If you were to ask me what's going to fucking happen in The Trouble with Peace, I honestly don't know. I'd like to see a little less romance, but we'll see what Joe Abercrombie gets up to. I have a few critiques here, but do I plan on picking up book 2 on release day and reading it immediately? Hell yeah, I do. Always happy to see what's going on in the first law world. And, I'll try to come back and do maybe another discussion sometime soon on at least the initial trilogy, if not all kind of 7 subsequent books up to this point. Throw a link down in the description maybe if I get around to that soon. But, yep, A Little Hatred. Thumbs up. Very cool, very interesting. Enjoyed it. Look forward to more. All right. Later, everyone.